Beneath the azure skies of the Mediterranean, a dark cloud of tyranny and violence gathered. This was Fascist Italy, a nation where Benito Mussolini's iron-fisted rule smothered the voice of dissent and liberty. It was a time marked by the infamous years between the 1920s and 1940s, where the boot of fascism stomped upon the face of humanity. One cannot forget the bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, a horrific act of aggression during the Spanish Civil War, orchestrated by the German Luftwaffe with support from the Italian Aviazione Legionaria and the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, which comprised regular army units and Blackshirts from the fascist paramilitary. This event remains a stark reminder of the brutality of totalitarian regimes. Vividly immortalized in Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica, it continues to symbolize the devastation of war. But the horrors did not end there. Mussolini's conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 was a chapter stained by the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons such as mustard gas against combatants and civilians alike. The skies of Ethiopia wept with the poison of oppression as countless innocents suffered under the tyranny of conquest. It was in this era of brutality and moral darkness that Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, stood before the League of Nations on June 30th, 1936, and voiced a prophecy that would echo through the ages. "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." These words, a dire warning of the contagious nature of fascist aggression, resonate with chilling clarity. Can you imagine the despair and hopelessness that gripped the hearts of those who suffered under the shadow of fascism? Join us as we unravel the cruel tapestry of Fascist Italy's atrocities. We delve into a time where ambition and cruelty walked hand in hand, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Welcome to the diary of Julius Caesar. The dawn of despotism, Mussolini's march to power. In the tumultuous aftermath of World War I, Italy was a nation in turmoil. The seeds of discontent, sown by economic strife and political instability, found fertile ground in the disillusioned Italian populace. It was in this cauldron of chaos that Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned radical nationalist, began his inexorable rise to power, culminating in the birth of Fascist Italy. The year 1919 marked a pivotal moment in this journey. Italy, though on the victorious side of the Great War, felt betrayed by the Paris Peace Conference. Italians expected territorial gains promised in the Treaty of London, 1915, but the outcome was bitterly disappointing, giving rise to the term mutilated victory. This nationalistic grievance was a critical element that Mussolini exploited. Mussolini's fascist party, founded in 1919, capitalized on the widespread disillusionment. They promised to revive Italy's economy, restore its national pride, and stabilize the political chaos. The fascist ideology, a unique blend of extreme nationalism, militaristic symbolism, and anti-communist sentiment, resonated with many, particularly in the war-torn northern regions. The fascists' rise was rapid and violent. They formed armed squads known as Blackshirts, responsible for brutal attacks on socialists, communists, and other political opponents. These squads, often composed of disgruntled war veterans, brought a sense of order amidst the chaos, which ironically gained them support from the conservative middle class and the industrial elite. The fascists claimed they were protecting Italy from communist revolution, which was a real fear after the Bolshevik success in Russia. Mussolini's masterful use of propaganda played a crucial role. He portrayed himself as a man of action, a leader who could restore Italy's glory. His speeches were fiery and emotive, delivered with a theatrical flair that captivated audiences. He promised to rebuild Italy's economy through corporatism, a system that aimed to unite different sectors of the economy under state control, ostensibly to reduce class conflict. The turning point came in 1922. Italy was in a state of political deadlock, and the government seemed incapable of restoring order. Seizing this opportunity, Mussolini staged the infamous March on Rome in October. Although less a military parade and more a political maneuver, it convinced King Victor Emmanuel III to avoid potential bloodshed by inviting Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini's appointment as Prime Minister on October 29, 1922, was initially viewed by many as a temporary measure. However, through a combination of legal manipulation, political skill, and outright intimidation, Mussolini systematically dismantled the democratic institutions. By 1925, he had declared himself Il Duce, the leader, and Italy was effectively under a dictatorship. Fascist Italy, under Mussolini's rule, became characterized by its aggressive foreign policy, its ruthless suppression of dissent, and its grandiose yet often economically dubious projects like the draining of the Pontine marshes. The regime's cult of personality centered around Mussolini, and the fascist party's influence permeated every aspect of Italian life. One of the most telling anecdotes of Mussolini's control was his claim that he had made the Italian trains run on time. This statement, whether factually true or not, became emblematic of the regime's propaganda efforts to portray itself as the efficient savior of Italian society. The iron grip of Il Duce, Mussolini's road to absolute power. In the annals of 20th century history, the rise of Benito Mussolini's dictatorship stands as a stark reminder of how easily democracy can be dismantled. From his appointment as Prime Minister in 1922 to establishing an unchallenged dictatorship, Mussolini's journey was marked by a series of calculated moves, each tightening his grip on Italy. The initial phase of Mussolini's regime was somewhat deceptive, appearing to work within the existing political framework. However, beneath this facade, the seeds of totalitarianism were being sown. A master of political maneuvering, Mussolini gradually increased his power, exploiting both legal means and outright intimidation. The year 1924 was a turning point. The election that year was marred by violence and electoral fraud, with the fascist party securing an overwhelming majority. This victory was overshadowed by the brutal murder of socialist leader Giacomo Matteotti, who had boldly denounced the fascists' tactics. Matteotti's assassination, widely believed to be orchestrated by fascists, triggered a crisis. Mussolini, however, skillfully navigated this turbulent period, portraying himself as the only one capable of restoring order. In the following years, Mussolini systematically dismantled the democratic institutions of Italy. The Acerbo law, passed in 1923, had already rigged the electoral system in favor of the fascist party. By 1925 to 1926, a series of laws were enacted that abolished freedom of the press, dissolved all opposition parties, and set up a secret police force known as OVRA. The OVRA played a crucial role in suppressing dissent, with thousands of political opponents arrested, exiled, or eliminated. The fascist regime also exerted control over all aspects of Italian society. Educational reforms were implemented to indoctrinate the youth with fascist ideology. The media became a tool for propaganda, glorifying Mussolini and the regime while censoring any dissenting voices. Mussolini's image was omnipresent, with slogans like "Mussolini is always right" and "Believe, Obey, Fight" becoming part of everyday life. Mussolini's consolidation of power was not just through repression, but also through strategic alliances. He garnered the support of the Catholic Church through the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which resolved the long-standing Roman question by recognizing Vatican City as an independent state and granting the Church certain privileges in Italy. Economically, Mussolini pursued a policy of autarky, aiming for self-sufficiency to reduce dependence on foreign imports. Large public works projects were initiated, aimed at both improving infrastructure and demonstrating the regime's power. However, these efforts had mixed results, with the economy remaining relatively weak and dependent on foreign trade. The cult of personality around Mussolini was a cornerstone of his dictatorship. He was portrayed as a superhuman figure, the embodiment of the nation's will and the architect of Italy's resurgence. This cult was carefully cultivated through propaganda, with Mussolini's speeches and public appearances choreographed to reinforce his image as a dynamic and powerful leader. Under Mussolini, Italy transformed into a police state where dissent was ruthlessly crushed, and the individual was subsumed under the collective will of the fascist state. Mussolini's rule was characterized by a combination of political savvy, brutal repression, and propaganda, enabling him to maintain his dictatorship until his downfall in World War II. Shadows of oppression, the 1938 racial laws, and the Jewish plight in Italy. In the chilling narrative of fascist Italy, the year 1938 marks a particularly somber chapter. It was the year Benito Mussolini's regime, already entrenched in authoritarianism, took a decisive turn towards racial persecution with the introduction of the racial laws. These laws, deeply influenced by Nazi Germany's racist ideology, unleashed a wave of suffering and discrimination against the Jews in Italy, a community that had been an integral part of Italian society for centuries. Prior to this dark turn, the Jewish community in Italy, numbering around 47,000, had enjoyed relative integration and freedom. However, the winds of change began to blow as Mussolini sought closer ties with Adolf Hitler's Germany. The fascist regime's embrace of anti-Semitic policies was a shocking reversal, one that aligned Italy with the Nazis' virulent hatred of Jews. The racial laws, officially announced in the summer and autumn of 1938, comprised a series of legislative acts that systematically stripped Italian Jews of their rights and dignity. The first blow was the Manifesto of Race, published in July 1938, which falsely proclaimed the existence of a pure Italian race and declared Jews to be foreigners. This pseudo-scientific racial propaganda laid the groundwork for the legal persecution that followed. In September 1938, the Italian government passed laws that barred Jews from public schools and universities, prohibited them from holding government jobs, and excluded them from the military. Further, these laws impacted the professional lives of many, as Jews were banned from owning or managing businesses with over 100 employees. The economic impact was immediate and devastating, with many losing their livelihoods overnight. Perhaps the most personal and profound impact was on everyday social life. Marriages between Jews and Aryans were forbidden. This not only severed existing relationships, but also isolated the Jewish community, marking them as outsiders in their own country. The Italian Jewish community, once an integral part of the nation's cultural tapestry, found itself ostracized and marginalized. The regime's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to reinforce these laws, bombarding the Italian populace with anti-Semitic rhetoric. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films depicted Jews as enemies of the Italian race, fueling prejudice and hate. Even children's textbooks were not spared, with new editions containing derogatory references to Jews. The racial laws' implementation varied across Italy, with some areas enforcing them more zealously than others. However, the overall impact was a climate of fear and uncertainty for Italian Jews. Families were torn apart, careers were ruined, and a sense of betrayal pervaded the community, which had once felt secure in their Italian identity. As World War II progressed, and Italy became more entangled with Nazi Germany, the situation worsened. In 1943, following Italy's surrender and the subsequent German occupation, Italian Jews faced deportations to concentration camps. Approximately 8,000 Italian Jews perished in the Holocaust, a tragic outcome of the fascist regime's embrace of Nazi ideology. Echoes of desolation, the forgotten Italian concentration camps. In the somber history of World War II, the Italian concentration camps, often overshadowed by the horrors of their Nazi counterparts, represent a grim chapter in the chronicle of human suffering. Established across various Italian-controlled territories, these camps were a stark manifestation of fascist Italy's brutal policies, particularly in places like Rhodes and Libya. The genesis of Italian concentration camps dates back to the late 1930s, following Italy's campaigns in North Africa and the Balkans. Benito Mussolini's imperial ambitions led to the establishment of these camps, designed not only to suppress resistance, but also to enforce racial laws and political agendas. Unlike Nazi extermination camps, Italian camps were primarily intended for internment and forced labor, but this did not lessen their cruelty. In Libya, the camps were set up as part of Italy's efforts to quell resistance, among the local population. The most notorious among them was the camp at El Agheila, established in 1930. Here, and in other camps like it, the conditions were harrowing. The internees, including men, women and children, were subjected to forced labor, starvation and disease. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and medical care was a distant dream. The death toll was staggering, with estimates suggesting that tens of thousands perished in these camps, primarily from malnutrition and illness. In the Dodecanese Islands, including Rhodes, the Italian fascist regime set up camps for different purposes. Here, the victims were primarily political prisoners and Jews, especially after the 1938 racial laws. The camp on the island of Rhodes, for instance, became a holding center for Jews before their deportation to Auschwitz. The conditions in these camps, while not as lethal as those in Libya, were nonetheless dire. Overcrowding, inadequate food, and poor hygiene were common, breaking both the body and spirit of the internees. The Italian concentration camps were also marked by a rigid system of control and surveillance. The camp authorities exercised absolute power over the inmates, often subjecting them to cruel and arbitrary punishments. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, with escape attempts being virtually impossible. These camps were not just places of physical confinement, but also tools of psychological warfare, aimed at breaking the will of those deemed enemies of the fascist regime. One notable aspect of the Italian concentration camps was their relative obscurity during and after the war. While the atrocities of the Holocaust and the brutality of Nazi concentration camps have been extensively documented, the Italian camps remained largely out of the spotlight. This lack of awareness, both in Italy and internationally, has contributed to a historical blind spot regarding the full scope of Fascist Italy's wartime atrocities. The engine of illusion, propaganda in Mussolini's Italy. In the narrative of Fascist Italy, propaganda was not merely a tool. It was the lifeblood that sustained Mussolini's regime, a crucial mechanism for controlling public opinion and embedding fascist ideology into the fabric of Italian society. Under the shadow of Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, propaganda in Italy became an art form, a masterful blend of myth, spectacle and fear, designed to create a unified fascist culture. The fascist propaganda machine was a vast and complex network, encompassing all forms of media. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, cinema, and later television were all harnessed to spread the fascist doctrine. Mussolini, acutely aware of the power of media, personally took charge of the Ministry of Press and Propaganda in 1935. This move centralized control over all media outlets, ensuring that every message conveyed to the public was in strict alignment with fascist ideals. One of the regime's first acts was to establish the Undersecretariat for Press and Propaganda in 1922, later transformed into the Ministry of Popular Culture in 1937. This body oversaw the dissemination of propaganda, filtering and shaping information to create a glorified image of Mussolini and the fascist party. Newspapers like Il Popolo d'Italia, founded by Mussolini himself, and the widely read Corriere della Sera were instrumental in this process, portraying Mussolini as an infallible leader and champion of the Italian people. The fascist regime was particularly adept at utilizing modern technology to its advantage. Radio broadcasting became a vital tool for reaching the masses, with Mussolini's speeches being transmitted across the country. His voice, powerful and charismatic, became a constant presence in the lives of Italians, creating an almost mythical image of the leader. The regime also made significant inroads into cinema, understanding its potential for mass persuasion. Films were produced not only to entertain, but to indoctrinate, often depicting fascist Italy as a utopia of strength, unity, and national grandeur. Propaganda extended beyond the media into the realm of culture and art. The regime organized grandiose public events, parades, and exhibitions, all carefully staged, to convey the power and success of fascism. These events were spectacles of state power, designed to awe the public and reinforce loyalty to the regime. The most famous of these was the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, an exhibition held in 1932 to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the fascist march on Rome. It showcased the achievements of the fascist regime, rewriting history to fit the fascist narrative. Education was another frontier for propaganda. The fascist regime overhauled the educational system, embedding fascist ideology into the curriculum. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify the regime and vilify its enemies. Children were indoctrinated from a young age through the Opera Nazionale Balilla, a youth organization that combined physical training with fascist indoctrination. Fascist propaganda was not limited to glorifying the regime. It also served as a tool for demonizing its enemies. The regime frequently used propaganda to incite fear and hatred against perceived threats, such as socialists, communists, and later Jews. This culture of fear bolstered the regime's control, as dissent became synonymous with treachery. The effectiveness of fascist propaganda in Italy was undeniable. It created a cult of personality around Mussolini, elevating him to a near-divine status. The Italian people were bombarded with images and messages that reinforced fascist values, shaping public opinion and suppressing dissent. The fascist propaganda machine turned the truth into a malleable commodity, bending it to fit the desires and ambitions of the regime. Italy's wartime saga, the Axis bet, and its aftermath. Italy's role in World War II, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, was marked by ambition, miscalculation, and eventual downfall. Allying with Nazi Germany, Italy sought to assert itself as a dominant European power. However, this alliance and participation in various military campaigns ultimately led to its own undoing. Mussolini's Italy entered World War II on June 10, 1940, declaring war on Britain and France. This decision was driven by Mussolini's desire to seize a place in the sun alongside Hitler's Germany. The alliance with Germany, formalized in the Pact of Steel in 1939, was a strategic move by Mussolini to expand Italian influence. However, it also tied Italy's fate to that of Nazi Germany. Italy's initial military campaigns were ambitious, but ultimately disastrous. The invasion of Greece in October 1940, intended as a quick victory, turned into a humiliating defeat, requiring German assistance. Similarly, in North Africa, Italian forces struggled against the British, leading to significant losses in men and equipment. This necessitated the deployment of German troops under General Erwin Rommel to aid their Italian allies. The Italian military's performance was hampered by several factors: outdated equipment, insufficient training, and often poor leadership. Despite these setbacks, Italian troops fought in various theaters of war, including the Eastern Front alongside German forces, and in the Balkans to secure the Axis southern flank. The Italian Navy, Regia Marina, played a crucial role in the Mediterranean, engaging in several critical battles, including the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941 and the prolonged struggle for control of the Mediterranean shipping lanes. Despite some successes, the Italian fleet faced numerous challenges, including a lack of fuel and air cover, which limited its effectiveness. The turning point for Italy came in 1943. Following the Allied landings in Sicily and the relentless bombing of Italian cities, faith in Mussolini and the war effort waned. On July 25, 1943, Mussolini was deposed and arrested, and Italy's new government sought an armistice with the Allies. On September 8, 1943, Italy officially surrendered, switching sides to join the Allies against Germany. However, the war was far from over for Italy. Germany quickly occupied northern Italy, freeing Mussolini and establishing the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet state. This led to a brutal and chaotic civil war, with Italian partisans, supported by the Allies, fighting against Mussolini's fascist loyalists and their German allies. The Italian campaign became a protracted and bloody struggle, with cities like Rome, Florence, and Bologna becoming battlegrounds. The Allied advance was slow and costly, bogged down by the rugged Italian terrain and stiff German resistance. The war left a deep scar on the Italian landscape and psyche, with cities and towns devastated and thousands of civilians dead. Italy's role in World War II was a journey from aggressive expansionism to humiliating defeat, and ultimately to a painful internal conflict. The alliance with Nazi Germany proved to be a catastrophic gamble, dragging the country into a global conflict for which it was ill-prepared. The war left Italy politically divided, economically shattered, and socially traumatized, marking the end of the fascist regime and the beginning of a difficult road to recovery. Shadows of brutality, the forgotten atrocities of Italian forces. In the historical narrative of World War II, the war crimes and atrocities committed by Italian forces remain a less explored but equally disturbing chapter. The fascist regime under Benito Mussolini not only allied with Nazi Germany, but also conducted its own campaign of brutality, particularly in Ethiopia and the Balkans. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 marked the beginning of a brutal campaign. Seeking to expand its empire, Italy launched a full-scale assault on the African nation. One of the most horrific aspects of this invasion was the use of chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas, against not only Ethiopian soldiers, but also civilians. This flagrant violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons, resulted in widespread suffering and death. The gas attacks were often indiscriminate, targeting hospitals, ambulances, and water sources, causing immense suffering to the Ethiopian people. In addition to chemical warfare, Italian troops were responsible for numerous massacres. The most notorious was the massacre of Addis Ababa in February 1937, following an assassination attempt on the Viceroy of Italian East Africa, Rodolfo Graziani. In retaliation, Italian forces killed thousands of Ethiopians over a 3-day period. The exact number of casualties remains unknown, but estimates range from 6,000 to 30,000. The massacre was characterized by indiscriminate killing, with soldiers and Blackshirt militias slaughtering men, women, and children alike. The atrocities extended beyond Ethiopia. During World War II, Italian forces committed war crimes in the Balkans, particularly in Yugoslavia and Greece. In Yugoslavia, Italian occupation was marked by widespread violence against the local population, including mass executions, reprisal killings, and the establishment of concentration camps. The Rab concentration camp, located on the island of Rab in modern-day Croatia, was one of the most notorious, where thousands of Slovenes, Croats, and Jews suffered from malnutrition, disease, and abuse. In Greece, the Italian occupation was characterized by looting, burning of villages, and the massacre of civilians. The Domenicon massacre in 1943 is a stark example, where Italian troops killed approximately 150 civilians in response to a partisan attack. This pattern of reprisals against civilians was a common tactic employed by Italian forces, aimed at suppressing resistance, but often exacerbating local opposition. The Italian military's conduct in these regions was not merely the actions of rogue soldiers, but part of a broader strategy of terror and suppression. These atrocities were often carried out with the knowledge or direct orders of high-ranking Italian military officials, reflecting the fascist regime's ruthless approach to warfare and occupation. Despite the severity of these crimes, the issue of Italian war crimes has often been overshadowed by the larger-scale atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. In the post-war period, many Italian war criminals were not held accountable, and the atrocities were largely left out of the public discourse in Italy. It was only decades later that a more critical examination of Italy's role in the war and its conduct began to emerge. The Iron Veil, OVRA, and the rise of fascist surveillance. In the tapestry of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, the OVRA, Opera Volontaria per la Repressione del Antifascismo, stands as a sinister precursor to the more infamous Gestapo of Nazi Germany. Established in 1927 under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, the OVRA was the regime's primary instrument for suppressing dissent and enforcing its authoritarian rule. The creation of the OVRA was a pivotal moment in the consolidation of Mussolini's power. It marked a transition from the earlier, more violent phase of fascist consolidation, characterized by the Blackshirts' street violence, to a more systematic and state-controlled approach to repression. Arturo Bucchini, appointed as the head of the Italian police in 1926, played a crucial role in the formation and operation of the OVRA. The primary mission of the OVRA was to monitor, infiltrate, and suppress any form of opposition to the fascist regime. This included socialists, communists, liberal Democrats, and even nonconformist intellectuals. The OVRA operated with a chilling efficiency, employing a vast network of informants and agents. It is estimated that by the late 1930s, the OVRA had a network of around 100,000 informants, a staggering number for a country the size of Italy. The methods of the OVRA were varied and insidious. They ranged from surveillance and interception of correspondence to more coercive tactics like arbitrary arrests, imprisonment without trial, and torture. The organization maintained a vast archive of dossiers on Italian citizens, collecting information on their political activities, personal associations, and even private lives. The OVRA's reach extended beyond Italy's borders, with agents operating in other European countries to track exiled anti-fascists. One of the most infamous cases of OVRA's operation was the arrest and subsequent death of the anti-fascist brothers Carlo and Nello Roselli in 1937. Their assassination in France, allegedly orchestrated by the OVRA, was a stark demonstration of the length to which Mussolini's regime would go to silence its enemies. The OVRA also played a crucial role in the enforcement of the fascist regime's racial laws. Starting in 1938, it was instrumental in identifying and persecuting Jews, leading to arrests, confiscation of property, and eventual deportation to Nazi concentration camps. Despite its widespread operations, the OVRA remained a shadowy organization, with much of its workings kept secret even from other parts of the Italian state apparatus. Its agents were often anonymous, operating in the background, which added to the climate of fear and suspicion that pervaded Italian society under fascism. After the fall of Mussolini's regime in 1943, many OVRA agents were tried for their crimes, but the full extent of the organization's activities and its impact on Italian society remained largely unexplored for decades. The legacy of the OVRA, with its vast network of surveillance and repression, is a sobering reminder of the mechanisms of control employed by totalitarian regimes. Shadows on the Iberian front, Italy's role in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, a prelude to the global conflict that was World War II, saw the Italian military play a significant yet often understated role. Under Mussolini's directive, Italy's intervention was not just a military campaign, but also an ideological crusade to support Francisco Franco's nationalist forces against the Republican government. This intervention was a defining moment in Italian foreign policy, revealing the fascist regime's broader ambitions in Europe. Italy's involvement in the Spanish Civil War began shortly after the conflict erupted in July 1936. Mussolini, seeing an opportunity to expand fascist influence and counteract communism, quickly offered support to Franco. By the end of the war in 1939, Italy had deployed around 50,000 to 75,000 troops, a significant force that played a crucial role in several key battles. The Italian contingent in Spain, known as the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, included regular army units, Blackshirts, members of the fascist paramilitary, and the Aviazione Legionaria, an air force detachment. The Italians were equipped with tanks, aircraft, and artillery, showcasing Italy's military prowess. One of the most infamous episodes involving Italian forces was the bombing of Guernica in April 1937, carried out by the German Condor Legion with the support of the Italian Aviazione Legionaria. This attack, immortalized by Pablo Picasso's painting, became a symbol of the horrors of aerial warfare against civilians. The Italian troops saw action in major battles, such as the Battle of Guadalajara in March 1937. Intended as a swift victory to showcase Italian strength, the battle turned into a debacle, with the Italian forces suffering heavy losses against the well-organized Republican troops. This defeat was a significant blow to Mussolini's prestige and raised questions about the effectiveness of the Italian military. Despite setbacks, Italian forces contributed significantly to the nationalists' eventual victory. They provided not only manpower, but also technical expertise, particularly in the use of artillery and aviation. Italian pilots engaged in air raids against Republican targets and provided crucial air support in ground operations. The Italian intervention in Spain was not just a military endeavor, but also had a propaganda dimension. Mussolini used the war to promote fascist ideology and to project Italy as a leading power in Europe. The Italian media was flooded with tales of heroism and sacrifice, portraying the volunteers as crusaders against communism. This narrative, however, often clashed with the reality of the conflict, where Italian troops were involved in atrocities and reprisals against civilians. The Italian involvement in the Spanish Civil War also had broader implications for international relations. It strained Italy's relationship with France and Britain, who were concerned about the rise of fascist influence in Europe. Additionally, it brought Italy closer to Nazi Germany, with whom they shared a common interest in supporting Franco. After the war, the Italian intervention in Spain was largely regarded as a strategic blunder by Mussolini. It drained Italy's resources and exposed weaknesses in its military capabilities. Furthermore, the intervention did little to improve Italy's strategic position in Europe, instead isolating it further diplomatically. Brutal shadows: Italy's war against partisans. During World War II, Italy witnessed a fierce and brutal conflict, not just against foreign armies, but within its own borders. The Italian response to the rise of partisan resistance, particularly during the later years of the war, was marked by a campaign of harsh reprisals and massacres, a grim testament to the brutalities of anti-partisan warfare. The Italian partisan movement, a diverse and decentralized network of resistance groups, gained momentum following Italy's armistice with the Allies in September 1943. These groups comprised former soldiers, political dissidents, and ordinary civilians who took up arms against the occupying German forces and the Italian fascist regime. Their activities ranged from sabotage and intelligence gathering to direct, armed confrontations. Faced with growing partisan resistance, the fascist authorities and their German allies embarked on a campaign of violent suppression. This campaign was characterized by a strategy of terror and retribution, aimed not just at the partisans, but also at civilian populations accused of supporting them. One of the most notorious examples of these reprisals was the Marzabotto massacre. Between September and October 1944, German troops, with the assistance of fascist militias, killed approximately 770 civilians in the town of Marzabotto and its surroundings. This massacre was a response to partisan activities in the region and was one of the worst atrocities committed on Italian soil during the war. Another infamous incident was the massacre of Sant'Anna di Stazzema in August 1944, where over 560 civilians, including women, children, and elderly, were brutally murdered by German troops. This act of unfathomable cruelty was also a reprisal against the local support for partisans. The Ardeatine massacre in March 1944 further illustrates the ruthlessness of the anti-partisan campaign. In retaliation for a partisan attack in Rome that killed 33 German policemen, German occupation forces executed 335 Italian civilians and political prisoners. This massacre was carried out with cold efficiency, each victim shot in the back of the head in the Ardeatine caves. These reprisals were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader strategy of terror. The fascist and German forces often used a policy of collective responsibility, where entire towns and communities were punished for the actions of a few. This policy was intended to break the morale of the partisans and deter support from the civilian population. The anti-partisan warfare in Italy was also marked by the use of summary executions and torture. Captured partisans and suspected collaborators were often executed without trial, while others were subjected to brutal interrogations. The Italian Social Republic, established in 1943 under Mussolini, played a significant role in this campaign, with its security forces, notably the Black Brigades, actively participating in the suppression of partisans. Despite the brutal efforts to crush them, the Italian partisans continued to resist, becoming a significant force that contributed to the eventual liberation of Italy. Their struggle was not just a military one, but also a moral stand against fascism and occupation. Silence under the regime. Political dissent in Fascist Italy. The suppression of political dissent in Fascist Italy was a calculated, relentless endeavor carried out with chilling efficiency under Benito Mussolini's regime. The hallmarks of this suppression were the use of a secret police force, widespread imprisonment, and in some cases, execution. This oppressive environment cast a long shadow over Italy, silencing voices of opposition and instilling a climate of fear. The creation of the OVRA, the fascist secret police, in 1927, marked the beginning of a systematic campaign against political dissent. Led by Arturo Bocchini, the OVRA was a formidable instrument of control, operating with a network of spies and informants. Its reach extended beyond Italy's borders, targeting anti-fascist activists abroad as well. The OVRA's tactics were ruthless, involving surveillance, interception of communications, and the use of informants to infiltrate opposition groups. Imprisonment of political dissidents became commonplace. The regime established a series of prison islands, such as Ponza and Ventotene, where anti-fascists were detained without trial. These prisons became known for their harsh conditions, where prisoners endured poor sanitation, insufficient food, and, in many cases, torture. Prominent figures like Antonio Gramsci, a founder of the Italian Communist Party, spent years in Mussolini's jails, with Gramsci's health deteriorating significantly during his incarceration. Executions, though less frequent than in some other totalitarian regimes, did occur. They served as a stark warning to those who dared to challenge the regime's authority. One of the most notorious cases was the execution of the Rosselli brothers, Carlo and Nello, leading anti-fascist intellectuals who were assassinated in France in 1937 in an operation believed to be orchestrated by the OVRA. The fascist regime also wielded censorship as a tool to suppress dissent. Newspapers, books, and other forms of media were tightly controlled, ensuring that only pro-fascist views were disseminated. This media manipulation extended to the education system, where fascist ideology was ingrained in the curriculum, shaping the minds of young Italians to align with the regime's doctrines. Despite the climate of fear, resistance to Mussolini's regime persisted. Underground networks of anti-fascist groups, both within Italy and among the Italian diaspora, worked tirelessly to oppose the regime. Their activities ranged from distributing anti-fascist literature to organizing strikes and demonstrations, often at great personal risk. The regime's suppression of political dissent had far-reaching consequences. It not only silenced immediate opposition, but also created a pervasive atmosphere of fear that affected all levels of society. Intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens were forced to conform, often publicly renouncing their previous beliefs, in what became known as fascistization of the society. The end of World War II and Mussolini's downfall in 1943 marked the beginning of a new chapter for Italy. However, the legacy of the regime's suppression of dissent lingered. The years of oppression had left deep scars, with many Italians grappling with the collective trauma of the fascist era. The last stand of fascism, the Italian Social Republic, and the Holocaust. The Italian Social Republic, a puppet state of Nazi Germany, was established in the wake of Italy's capitulation in September 1943. This entity, presided over by Benito Mussolini after his rescue from imprisonment by German commandos, represented the final, desperate phase of fascist rule in Italy. Its establishment signaled not only a continuation of fascist ideology, but also a tragic chapter in Italy's involvement in the Holocaust. Following the armistice between Italy and the Allied forces, the northern and central parts of Italy were occupied by Germany. It was in this context that the Italian Social Republic, also known as the Salo Republic, after the town of Salo, its de facto capital, was born. This regime, existing from 1943 to 1945, was characterized by its dependency on Nazi Germany and its commitment to continue the war alongside the Axis powers. Under Mussolini's nominal leadership, the Italian Social Republic became an instrument of Nazi policy. One of the most heinous aspects of this collaboration was the regime's participation in the Holocaust. While anti-Semitic laws had been introduced in Fascist Italy before, the establishment of the Italian Social Republic marked a more direct involvement in the persecution and deportation of Jews. The statistics of this period paint a harrowing picture. Approximately 8,000 Jews from the territory of the Italian Social Republic were deported to Nazi concentration camps, most notably Auschwitz. These deportations were often facilitated by the Italian police and fascist militias, who rounded up Jews and handed them over to German authorities. One of the most infamous examples of this collaboration was the raid of the Jewish ghetto in Rome on October 16, 1943. In a single day, over 1,000 Jews were arrested and later deported to Auschwitz. Only a few would survive. This event underscored the regime's complicity in the Nazis' final solution. The Italian Social Republic also saw the resurgence of fascist violence and repression. The regime's security apparatus, including the notorious Black Brigades, carried out a campaign of terror against partisans, political dissidents, and any perceived enemies of the state. Summary executions, torture, and reprisals against civilians were common, adding to the climate of fear and violence that characterized the last years of the war in Italy. Mussolini, once the unchallenged dictator of Italy, was a shadow of his former self in the Italian Social Republic. Largely controlled by the German occupiers, he struggled to exert genuine authority. His speeches and policies during this period echoed Nazi ideology, emphasizing a commitment to total war and relentless anti-Semitic rhetoric. The Italian Social Republic's military efforts were primarily focused on combating the growing partisan movement within Italy. However, lacking significant resources and facing widespread disaffection among the Italian populace, these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The partisans, supported by the Allies, grew stronger and more organized, eventually playing a crucial role in the liberation of Italy and the downfall of Mussolini. The end of the Italian Social Republic came with the Allied advance into northern Italy and the insurrection of the Italian partisans. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland, but was captured and executed by Italian partisans. His death marked the definitive end of fascist rule in Italy. The fall of a dictator, Mussolini's end, and fascism's echoes in Italy. The capture and execution of Benito Mussolini marked a dramatic close to the era of fascism in Italy. This event, coupled with the post-war trials of fascist leaders, set the stage for a complex process of reckoning with the legacy and memory of fascism in Italy. Mussolini's downfall began with the Allied invasion of Italy and the subsequent collapse of his regime in 1943. Following his rescue by German paratroopers, he headed the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet state in northern Italy. However, as the war turned against the Axis powers, Mussolini's grip weakened. On April 27, 1945, as he attempted to flee to Switzerland, Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans near the village of Dongo on Lake Como. The following day, Mussolini, along with his mistress Clara Petacci and other fascist leaders, were executed by firing squad. Their bodies were then taken to Milan, where they were hung upside down at a gas station in the Piazzale Loreto, a public display that symbolized the end of fascism in Italy. This brutal end was both a moment of closure and a vivid demonstration of the deep anger and resentment that had accumulated against Mussolini and his regime. Following the war, Italy faced the daunting task of pursuing justice against those responsible for fascism and its atrocities. The most prominent post-war trial was the Verona trial in 1945, where leading members of the fascist regime were tried for their roles in the establishment of the Italian Social Republic. Many were found guilty and executed, but others received lighter sentences or were acquitted, reflecting the complexities and compromises of the post-war period. The post-war trials in Italy, however, did not have the same scale or impact as the Nuremberg trials in Germany. Many fascist officials and collaborators were never prosecuted, and some even continued to play roles in post-war Italian politics and society. This leniency partly stemmed from the Cold War context, where the focus shifted to combating communism, leading to a certain level of amnesty and amnesia regarding fascist crimes. The legacy and memory of fascism in Italy remain contentious and complex topics. In the immediate post-war period, the focus was on rebuilding the nation and establishing a democratic order, often leading to a suppression of discussions about the fascist past. However, over the years, there has been a growing public discourse on the need to confront this past. Efforts to come to terms with the fascist era have included the establishment of memorials and museums, such as the National Museum of the Italian Resistance, and educational initiatives to ensure that the lessons of this period are not forgotten. The anniversary of the liberation of Italy, celebrated on April 25th, has become a national holiday, commemorating the end of fascism and the Nazi occupation. As we close this somber journey through the dark corridors of fascist Italy, it's crucial to remember that history is not just a series of events, but a mirror reflecting the human condition. From the rise of Mussolini in 1922 to the fall of the Italian Social Republic in 1945, we've witnessed the harrowing depths to which humanity can sink under the sway of totalitarian rule. The Marzabotto massacre, the bombing of Guernica, the relentless suppression of political dissidents, and the tragic compliance in the Holocaust are stark reminders of the atrocities that can be committed in the name of ideology. In the words of Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce, history is the biography of humanity. This quote encapsulates our journey through the turbulent era of Mussolini's rule, reminding us that history is not just a sequence of events, but a story of human experiences, choices, and consequences. The shadows of the past stretch long, but in their midst we find the light of understanding, the resolve to resist tyranny, and the courage to build a future anchored in justice and human dignity. As we step forward, let us carry the lessons of history not as a burden, but as a beacon guiding us towards a more enlightened, compassionate, and peaceful world.